Hello, my name is Crispin Burke. I'm finishing up Webster University's Cybersecurity 6002 program, and this is my video presentation about my paper, which concerns the use of state-sponsored cybercrime against the United States and its NATO allies. And I have to say that this was a very interesting paper to put together, not the least of which is the fact that a lot of the details of the paper changed as I was going through the process. 2 weeks before the paper was due, Special Counsel Robert Mueller dropped charges on 12 Russian hackers, which changed about the last quarter of my paper. So it was very exciting to go through. But without further ado, here's my research paper. So my thesis is that we talk a lot about these digital Pearl Harbors, these cyber 9/11s, these massive catastrophic attacks on our nation's critical infrastructure. But what you're starting to see a lot of now is the use of mundane cybercrime by nation states. And in fact, the 4 primary nation state adversaries mentioned in the most recent National Defense Strategy, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, they all use this low-grade cybercrime against the United States and its NATO allies. So I kind of wanted to explore why they might be doing so. And it ties into a theory that's called the gray zone of military operations. There's no one universally recognized definition of the gray zone, but it generally has 2 characteristics. One is that it's a state of affairs which falls in between war and peace. It's not quite a hot war, but it's certainly not peace. It's an adversarial relationship. The second aspect is that the participants in gray zone conflicts often operate in a very hazy legal status. They're very difficult to identify. Some examples of this are Russia's use of the quote-unquote little green men in Crimea, the unmarked troops, its use of the Wagner Group contractors in Syria, and nowhere is that more true than in the case of cyber warfare. Hackers are very easy to deny. If you look back into the 2016 election, when candidate Trump was asked about Russian hacking interference on the DNC, he famously said it could be Russia, it could be China, it could be a 400-pound guy sitting on his bed. And if you look, that's also kind of the Russian rebuttal too. They often talk about the so-called patriotic hackers. And it gets even more tricky because many of these nation states set up false flag attacks. So you'll find it's very difficult to really construct a legitimate response to gray zone activities and cyber actions in particular. There are international norms for conflict. There are international norms now arising in the case of a destructive cyber attack, full-on cyber war, but there's not a very clear legal consensus in the case of state-sponsored cybercrime. So I'm going to go into a couple of examples of uses of cybercrime which have been sponsored by the 4 primary nation-state adversaries mentioned in the National Defense Strategy. So let's take a look at distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks. Obviously, everyone in this class probably knows what a DDoS attack is, but for those who may be watching this who don't know, denial of service attack occurs when a computer floods a website or another computer system with requests for information and eventually shuts down that computer. Distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, are basically denial of service attacks coming from multiple computers at once, and it's very easy to overwhelm a computer system if you have what's called a botnet, a lot of computers operating in concert to overwhelm that website. And a lot of these botnets consist of computers which have been infected with malware, completely unwitting participants, which is very easy to plausibly deny. Your computer could be participating in a denial of service attack right now and you wouldn't even know it. So that's one way that hackers are able to kind of disavow their actions. And so one of the first real known instance of a DDoS attack that was state-sponsored, and actually one of the first recorded instances of what people would call cyber war, was a massive DDoS attack on the nation of Estonia in 2007, which is largely thought to have been sponsored by the Russian government. And this had all the hallmarks, actually, of what independent hacking groups actually do. If you look at groups like Anonymous or LulzSec, they often organize these sorts of attacks on entities they do not like, that have upset them in some way. Famously, Anonymous took on the Church of Scientology with a DDoS attack. They just overwhelmed the Church of Scientology's website. gamers will overload the Microsoft or the Xbox server just for sheer lulls, really, just to irk everybody who picked up an Xbox for Christmas Day. And you'll find that this attack on Estonia fit many of these characteristics. On Russian language message boards, anonymous users were able to recruit a lot of people to download these tools to help them participate in these DDoS attacks. The hackers, which overwhelmed Estonia, tapped into an existing botnet of about 80,000 computers. So in many ways, it had some of the hallmarks of an independent hacking operation, but it fit the Russian government's narrative against Estonia, which had removed a statue commemorating Soviet war dead. And obviously there is a long history between Estonia and the USSR and now Russia. So it really fit the Russian government's agenda, but they were able to disavow it. Another example of a DDoS attack that was state-sponsored comes from Iran. In 2012, the Iranian government launched DDoS attacks against websites belonging to American banks. Now, why would Iran do that? Well, in 2012, the U.S. was ratcheting up sanctions. Actually, the international community was ratcheting up sanctions. The P5+1 powers, the UN, the EU, the U.S. were ratcheting up sanctions in conjunction with Iran's nuclear program and a slew of other issues. And so Iran retaliated against the United States through this DDoS attack. So this is one of those instances in which the implementation of sanctions might actually have a reverse effect. It might actually trigger cyber attacks. And with the United States pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, we may see more of that as we move forward. So that's one example of state-sponsored cyber crime. Okay, it looked exactly what independent hacking groups would normally do, but it was state-sponsored. Another very obvious form of cybercrime is intellectual property theft. China is kind of the leading actor in this. China had a long-running intellectual property campaign against the United States through cyber means. China does conduct intellectual property theft through a number of different methods. If you've ever bought knockoff Chinese clothing, that's intellectual property theft. And so it's a very pervasive campaign. But the Chinese were very active in using cyber means to steal intellectual property. They targeted everything from the defense sector to Coca-Cola. It's just pervasive. And in 2015, the Obama administration threatened to impose sanctions. And in this case, China agreed to drop much of its cyber intellectual property theft. Now, there's some talk that, and in fact, most cybersecurity firms actually verify that there was a 90% drop in cyber activity directed against the United States by China. That said, that there's a lot of talk that China may have directed its attention elsewhere to steal intellectual property theft and things like that. Another actor that likes to use intellectual property theft is Iran. A couple months ago, the Justice Department announced that it had charged about a dozen Iranian hackers who had taken part in a long-running IP campaign against American universities and businesses. These hackers were operating on the behalf of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, but they were actually contractors posing as a legitimate-sounding organization called the Mabna Institute. And they spearphished about 100,000 university accounts, and they were successful in gaining access to about 8,000 email accounts. So 1 in 12 targets handed over their login credentials, which is astounding. And it's estimated that the Iranian government took about $3 billion worth of intellectual property. That's significant. And obviously the talk of it is, even though Iran was alleviated from sanctions with regards to its nuclear program, there are still a number of American sanctions on Iran, and this is a way that Iran can get around those sanctions. So cybercrime is very attractive to them to help them access the market. Okay, now let's talk about false flag attacks. It's very easy to misattribute a cyber attack. And in fact, a very savvy cyber actor might disguise its efforts to look like that of another actor. So in 2015, there were a number of hacking attacks against the U.S. military by a group calling itself the Cyber Caliphate, hackers related to the Islamic State. In January 2015, they took over the Twitter feed of U.S. Central Command and posted very ominous messages saying, "Oh, we're in your computer, we're coming to get you," which is very concerning. That said, hacking into a Twitter feed is much different than actually accessing sensitive government information. And in fact, it was a very crude attack. It's something that a teenage prankster might accomplish. They didn't get any actual sensitive information. In fact, some of the information that they posted claiming it came from Central Command was a map of North Korea, which A, already exists in the public domain, and B, doesn't fall under Central Command. Central Command takes care of the Middle East. Another attack occurred when a number of military spouses received death threats via Twitter, and messages said, "We're coming to get you," etc., etc. As it turns out, these wives are targeted because they had a fairly high social profile. Some were activists, some were authors. They were in the media. And another attack came when ISIS posted the list of U.S. service members purportedly in contact with the Islamic State and their addresses. But if you actually looked at the names that they posted, all of these names were mentioned in press releases. So it would have been easy for the hackers to just look at names of press releases and then go to some sort of a public directory like Spoke.io or White Pages or 123 People Finder and find these addresses. So these were really kind of crude tactics, but they generated a lot of fear. But intelligence agencies came to a very interesting conclusion about the cyber caliphate. It wasn't associated with ISIS. It was actually a Russian hacking organization known as Fancy Bear, which is which works for the GRU, Russia's leading military intelligence organization. So why would elite Russian hackers want to take part in these kind of crude hijinks? And the answer that I think is that it kind of tied into Russia's long-standing misinformation campaign. If you look during the 2016 election, Islamophobia was a key talking point for Russian troll factories. Both sides of the issue, those who are irrationally afraid of Muslims and those who don't think that people should be irrationally afraid of Muslims. The trolls from Russia played on both sides of that debate. And I think that these hackers kind of wanted to generate that fear in the American public by impersonating the Islamic State. So that's an example of a false flag attack conducted by one actor. Kind of interesting. Vandalism. So the most famous or infamous example of cyber vandalism comes from the Sony hack of 2015, I believe it is, when hackers associated with North Korea hacked into Sony's database, posing as legitimate hackers that were trying to dox Sony and expose business practices, but were actually motivated by the fact that Sony had put together this comedy film in which Kim Jong-un dies at the end of the movie. Again, it's another example of a good false flag attack because their actions threw the media off track for weeks because many of their tactics resembled those from independent hacking groups. But in actuality, they were motivated by the movie which satirized Kim Jong-un. So cyber vandalism is not very common for nation states because it forces them to expose their tradecraft, but it is a tool that some nation states use, North Korea being one example. Okay. Ransomware. So last year, hundreds of thousands of computers were attacked by ransomware, right? A lot of cyber criminals use ransomware to extort money from their victims. The North Korean government actually participated in ransomware in 2017, and it's kind of an interesting story behind that. Over the last couple of years, the NSA had been stockpiling a number of vulnerabilities. They would find vulnerabilities or purchase vulnerabilities from the black market, and they keep them secret so they could use them for cyber weapons. One of which was an exploit in Windows XP. Windows XP was produced in 2001, and Microsoft stopped supporting it in 2014. So there were no security updates that would ever be published for Windows XP. So it was kind of a good cyber weapon to have for if you wanted to attack older computers. Those exploits were stolen from the NSA by a group called the Shadow Brokers, which are alleged to have ties to the Russian government. These exploits then made it onto the dark web, where presumably North Korea purchased it and used it as part of a ransomware attack against the entire world. Hundreds of thousands of computers were locked. It's estimated the North Korean government made off with about $80 million. Now, working against North Korea, and fortunately, there was a kill switch built into this program, and a number of cybersecurity experts worked together to shut down this ransomware attack, which was great. So the North Korean government did only made up with about $80 million, and the attack was stopped. But it's an example of how a nation state would use some sort of tactic that ordinary cyber criminals would use. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so here's the big one. The 2016 election. So there are three main aspects of the election that hackers targeted. The first was the hacking and doxing campaign by the Russian GRU, which, according to charges which were filed 9 days ago, was taken part by Russia's main military intelligence organization, as we talked about earlier, the GRU, the hacking group named Fancy Bear. Two organizations took part within Fancy Bear, and they're actually named in the indictment, took part in this operation. One was dedicated to the actual stealing of the emails, and one unit was dedicated to the leaking of the emails to DC Leaks and later WikiLeaks, the Guccifer 2.0 persona. So there was that operation. Second instance of cybercrime, which I think was kind of interesting, involves some mundane identity theft, which the Russian government took part in to conceal the source of ad funding conducted by the Internet Research Agency. So the IRA, the troll farm, would purchase ads on Facebook, Twitter, and a number of other sites. To conceal the source of funding, they took part in identity theft. They would steal Social Security numbers. They would steal driver's license numbers or PayPal accounts to conceal, to kind of launder the money into those ads, which, you know, you wouldn't think that an elite hacking organization would do that, but I think in this case, Russian intelligence tapped into the Russian cybercrime network, which is one of the largest cybercrime operations in the world. So that's a way that they, what I suspect the Russian government does is they turn a blind eye to Russian cybercrime as long as it attacks foreigners, and occasionally they'll call in a favor when they need to. And the last, and I think the most disturbing aspect of this, is the fact that the Fancy Bear hackers actually made it into the election systems of at least 21 US states, and they were successful in a couple of cases of gaining sufficient access to actually alter or delete votes or voter registration information, which is pretty disturbing, but they didn't press this advantage. And I think that it's because, it would have been too far. If any vote had been altered, that would have almost negated the entire election. And the second reason is I think that they just wanted to let people know that they were in the system. In case Hillary Clinton had won, you could look back at the election and you could look back at the DNC leaks in which Secretary Clinton was given an advantage over Bernie Sanders. You could look back at the hacking of the election systems, and you could build a narrative that the election was rigged, as candidate Trump had said. So I think that that's one reason they didn't press that advantage. And again, the details on this are still emerging. There's probably, it's Sunday morning, the 22nd of July right now. I'm sure there is more going on right now. Okay, so some of the implications. This opens up a lot of dangerous possibilities because, kind of like air power a century ago, cyber warfare now makes every American a target. You wouldn't think that state-sponsored hackers would be interested in a university professor or stealing Coca-Cola's secret recipe, but they are. So I think that opens up a lot of dangerous implications. Every American is a target for the state actors. So what should we do? One, a lot of people have asked, well, why do we charge foreign hackers when they're never going to see the inside of an American courtroom? Well, these charges do make life difficult on these hackers. It makes it difficult for them to travel outside their home country. And occasionally they slip up and they'll travel outside their home country and they'll get picked up by the authorities and extradited to the United States. So that's a reason we do this. The second thing is I think there needs to be more oversight on our cyber vulnerability program. The NSA and other intelligence agencies stockpile these vulnerabilities to use for cyber weapons. And the danger is that these things could get loose and then used against the United States. And that's very dangerous for us in a Western democracy because we are far more reliant on the internet than North Korea. If you took down North Korea's internet, you would not set them back. Their state website looks like it came out of GeoCities. But if you just took down Facebook in the United States, people would go nuts. Think of the way we communicate or do business over just that one website. So I think that we need to focus more on cyber defense than on offense. And then finally, look, This is for every single American. I know it sounds cliche, but you're all a target, and you need to practice better cyber hygiene. We're all in this together. All right. So, thanks. I think I went considerably over the 5-minute time limit, but that's my paper. Thanks for watching.